Welcome to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski. How many times do we say, I'm sorry, especially when we're in an argument or a tough situation? Now, what's the difference between apologizing and taking ownership? And when you do apologize, what is the intent to the apology? Because as women, more often than not, apologizing can be seen as a sign of weakness. So, to unpack all of this and more, I'm speaking with Meg Miller, Program Manager of Echelon Front, where she runs the Women's Assembly Extreme Ownership Academy. So, welcome, Meg. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Liz. I'm really excited to be here and just honored to be on the show. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I'm actually really excited to have you here as well. I've seen your webinars, I've seen your podcasts, and this topic really intrigued me. So let's begin. What similarities do apologizing and ownership share?
Great question. They definitely share some similarities as we think about them, both if we're doing them correctly or if we're doing them properly, they both are a recognition of fault. It's some error that we've made, some mistake that we've made, some decision that we made that didn't go so well. And the recognition of that requires us to apologize, or it requires us to take ownership. In order for us to get there, in order for us to feel like we can see our fault in that, we have to be humble. We have to have that humility to say, hey, I messed this thing up. I didn't do this thing so well. That was my fault. And we have to, in order to get there, we have to be able to detach from our emotions. So really look at the situation objectively, really see what my role was. What was my contribution in this situation? Now, if I can take a step back, I can have some humility about me. I can genuinely recognize where I messed up, and I can apologize or take ownership. So there's definitely threads between both of them. And I think the sincerity is probably the biggest piece. If we're really sincere and we really mean that apology, we're taking ownership, we're recognizing our fault in the situation. And so those similarities, like I said, there's some threads there that they both share.
So, what's important to think about when we consider an apology or even taking ownership?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned earlier, what is the intent? What am I really apologizing for? Am I apologizing for some standard or expectation that only I've set for myself and no one else knows? And I feel obligated to tell this other person, hey, I'm sorry. I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends last night, and she brought up this point that she has a tendency to say, sorry for the delay in an email or when she's speaking to a client. And it just really hit home this point for me, like, what is my intent? It's not necessarily that she's sorry for the delay. She's set this crazy expectation for herself that the client doesn't know. She didn't give the client a deadline, and yet here she is apologizing. So I think our intent is really important. I know I found myself in situations where I'm saying something like, sorry to bother you, or sorry for so many questions. And we've all been there, right? But what I found as I went through this topic and as I think about apologizing, I need to build a better relationship with that person. If I feel like I need to apologize, then that's an indication to me that I haven't built a good relationship. If I'm saying sorry to bother you, if I have a good relationship with someone, they're not going to see it as a bother. If I have a good relationship with someone, I'm asking them questions, they're going to feel like that's really important because we want to have that alignment. We want to be on the same page. We want each other to be curious about what's going on, whether it's something that's work related that's really important, or whether it's something at home with our families that, hey, the kids' schedules are all over the place. I need to ask a bunch of questions of my spouse or my partner or whoever to figure out how we're going to get the kids from A to B to C to D to E, and 3 of them at 3 separate times and 3 separate places, right? So our intent as we think about apologizing and ownership is really important. Also thinking about, yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Also thinking about, what is the impact? What is the impact of our decisions? What is the impact of our actions on other people? Are they low impact?
Being Canadian, I did say, sorry, go ahead. Just wanted to point that out to you. But we've got to go to a commercial break right now, but I think you've brought up so many wonderful pieces of information here regarding apologizing and ownership. And you're right. I mean, sorry for the delay. I mean, nobody expects you to respond right away. And a lot of people also say, may I ask you a question? Well, you just did, right? So we have to be very tactical when we ask questions. So don't go away. We will be right back. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski. Today we're talking about the difference about apologizing and taking ownership. So Meg, one of the questions that I had was, does every apology have a solution or an action piece?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is where we start to delineate a little bit between apologizing and taking ownership. I think I was going down this path before we went to the break, but what is our impact? What is the impact of my decisions? What is the impact of my actions, my behaviors? And when we consider that in terms of apologizing and taking ownership, I'm sorry, those are important words. Those are important words, especially when we think about relationships that we have. If we've done something or we've made a decision that's negatively impacted a relationship, we want to say, I'm sorry. That has a lot of meaning. That's really important to say. But we have to take that a next level. We have to take that a step further. And that's really where the ownership piece comes in, where we're implementing solutions, we're taking ownership of that thing, and we're actually taking action to fix that problem or to make sure we don't do that thing again, whatever it may be. So I think that's where we start to see a little bit of a difference between apologizing and taking ownership there.
So, what's important to keep in mind when taking ownership? Because I'm just trying to figure out how is it best to deliver that message.
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier. We have to be sincere and truly recognize our role in the situation. The worst thing that we can do is apologize or take ownership when we don't really mean it. We're just saying sorry to say sorry. So, really important that we're delivering that message with sincerity. And again, when we recognize the impact that we're having on others, and the more that we can explain this and say, hey, Liz, I realize that what I did impacted you. It was probably really frustrating. It was confusing, I imagine, at times. And I know that that made things harder for you. The more that we can recognize how our actions affect others and we can say this to them, that's going to help build that relationship. And then at Echelon Front, one of the things that we've come up with a framework. So when we deliver this message, when we take ownership, important for us to, again, be sincere, recognize our impact. We can utilize this framework that we have and then keep it succinct. We don't want to go on and on forever delivering this apology. We want to make sure that we're hitting those key and critical points without getting lost in a whole bunch of information that's really not important to the conversation.
So, Meg, why are the steps to taking ownership so important?
They're critical because they help whoever we're talking to, whether it's one person, it's our spouse, it's our teammate, it's our colleague, whoever it may be. The steps are really critical because it helps frame out that conversation. We explain the problem. We describe the consequence or the impact. Like I said, the better that we can do that, that helps. If I'm taking ownership with you, Liz, you can see when I describe the impact, you can see, oh, hey, Meg really does get how this impacted me. Okay, I'm going to continue to listen. So we explain the problem, we describe the impact, we take ownership, and then we talk about a solution. We provide a solution. And those steps are really critical because now we have some accountability in there, right?
Yeah.
I said, here's the solution that I'm going to do. So I need to make sure that I take action on this thing. You've heard it. You've heard me say it. So we can add in some accountability there with that solution, but really important that we take steps to implement that solution.
So, as women, apologizing can sometimes seem, it could be seen as a sign of weakness in the workplace. How do you deal with that?
It's a great question. And this is hard. I mean, I think it's hard as women that sometimes we feel like this can be seen as a sign of weakness. But I bet you if I asked you and I polled the audience and I said, here's leader A, who's someone who, when a mistake happens, They avert their eyes, they look down, they look around, they're not really engaged, versus leader B, who's someone a mistake happens and they step up and they take ownership of that. Who do you have more respect for in that situation? We know that it's leader B. We know you have more respect for that person who takes ownership. So it's not a sign of weakness. It actually helps us build respect oftentimes when we're taking ownership. But again, this is really hard. And as women, we can continue to perform. We can continue to execute to the best of our abilities, really make sure that we're doing the job as capable and as effectively as possible. And when those things go wrong, we take ownership. No one's perfect. We know it's going to happen. So we got to take ownership in those situations.
You know, you are right. This is really hard because when I first started looking at this topic, I was a little confused, but you're right on point. So I want to discuss this more when we return in a few minutes. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski. Today we're talking about the difference between apologizing and taking ownership. Now, Meg, I know that sometimes we might be in some sort of an argument and you look around and you think, what just happened? Where did this come from? And if you're not sure about what went wrong, how do you take ownership of that situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning. It really requires us to have some humility to be able to pull the thread, to really look at that situation objectively and see, what was my role? Again, what was my contribution? If I'm able to detach from that situation, we talk about detaching from emotions, not being emotionless, but we know our emotions, when we get caught up in those, they don't help us make good decisions. So if we can detach and really see objectively, okay, here's what happened, here was my role in this situation, now I can take ownership of that. And it doesn't mean that I have to own the whole thing, but I am absolutely going to take ownership of my role and what I did, what went wrong, or what mistake I made, what error, whatever the case may be. But our ability to do that really relies in our humility and really being able to, again, just take that step back for a moment to really assess the situation honestly and see where we went wrong.
So, Meg, what are some of the barriers to taking ownership?
There's so many. We could go on for days talking about this.
We don't have days, just as an FYI.
There are, unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers, and we've talked about a couple of them. You know, this fear of losing respect, fear of being the only one. Hey, if I'm the only one to take ownership in this situation, what does that mean? Right? But if we are the only one to take ownership, then that means we are the only one who can solve that problem. Not the only one who can solve that problem, but we can implement a solution to solve that problem. And oftentimes, you know, our goal with taking ownership is not with the expectation that someone else is going to do it. That's what happens, generally speaking, when we have good relationships, but that's not always the case. So that's a barrier: fear of being the only one, fear of losing respect. Probably the biggest barrier to us not taking ownership, it's our ego. It's ourselves. It's the lies that we tell ourselves, right? And the excuses that we make. And our ego is something that we're fighting all the time. Every one of us has one, and it is talking to us constantly. It's telling us things all the time about, Meg, you're right. It's not your fault. That's on somebody else. So we have to be able to recognize that ego when it's getting in the way, shut it down, subordinate that thing so that we can truly see what has happened, what's gone on in this situation, and take ownership where we need to take ownership. But those are just a couple of the barriers. As I said, Liz, we could go on for hours talking about the barriers, unfortunately, but the ego is probably the biggest one. It does get in our way a lot. It can be a really resourceful thing for us. It can also be a major hindrance for us being able to move forward, build good relationships, do a lot of the things that we want to do.
You know, ego is a deadly thing to have because a lot of people don't want to apologize because of an ego, and they don't want to take ownership because of an ego. But I think in order for you to take ownership, you have to become vulnerable. And I think as human beings, there are times that, you know, we should be vulnerable and take ownership of a lot of the stuff.
Absolutely. That vulnerability is a big piece of it, right? Because it is saying it's not allowing our ego to get in the way. And it is being open and honest with someone about and admitting to a mistake. And sometimes those mistakes can be small, but sometimes those mistakes can be massive, big things. And we can't not take ownership of those things, but take ownership of the small things. So I think to your point, that vulnerability is really critical, especially for us as women. Oftentimes we can share with one another, but sometimes when we're sharing with another colleague or a larger group, it can be difficult. But I think that does build that respect. It does build that trust when we show that vulnerability. It shows others that, hey, it's okay to mess up. It's okay to make a mistake. And now we can solve that problem. We can implement a solution for that thing to go away so that it doesn't happen again, or that we fix that error moving forward. So that's a really great point. I appreciate the additional context there and really thoughtfulness there.
Well, thank you. And you know what I love the fact is that you said, it's okay if you make a mistake, you fix it and you move on, because too many people out there are afraid of making a decision because they're afraid of making the wrong decision. So don't go away. We'll be right back with more with Meg. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski. Today we're talking about the difference between apologizing and taking ownership with Meg Miller. She's the program manager of Echelon Front, where she runs the Women's Assembly Extreme Ownership Academy. So, Meg, what's the best way to get someone else to take ownership?
Yeah, this is one common question that we get all the time. And the best way to get someone else to take ownership is to lead by example, is to be the one who's taking ownership, who's stepping up to help people recognize the value in taking ownership. And again, you're doing it because you genuinely see your fault, your mistake, the impact that you had on somebody else. So you want to take ownership and you want to implement a solution. And when other people see that, they're like, oh, hey, things are getting better for Meg. She's solving problems. Things seem to be getting easier for her. She's taking this ownership thing. So maybe I should start doing that. So the best way that we can get others to take ownership is just to do it ourselves, to lead by example, to help them see the way. Because when we're solving problems, that means those problems are going away. And one thing we know about problems, if they go unaddressed, they tend to get bigger.
Yes,
and that's not what we want.
This is true. Okay, so let's talk about, how does taking ownership help me grow as a person, or a leader or a wife or a spouse or an employee or a child or whatever?
So taking ownership is a very liberating thing. When we take ownership, again, that means that we are solving problems. We're implementing solutions. So those problems, we're tackling them early. Those problems are going away. And good things happen when problems go away. Good things happen when we don't have problems facing us all the time, or those problems don't grow because they've gone unaddressed. So really important, because it gives us control. It gives us the opportunity to have control over those areas. And it's really empowering when we take ownership. So as I think about that as a daughter, a spouse, a aunt, a leader, when I think about the different and various roles that I have in my life, ownership has really allowed me to feel empowered. It's been really liberating because I'm able to take control of things that are in my world, solve those problems, and keep my mission, or keep the mission that I'm working on, moving forward.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I was going to jump in and say, taking ownership of it. I did this. It is extremely empowering. So we have a little bit of time left. I want to ask you, what is extreme ownership and where did it actually come from?
So extreme ownership was actually a book written by the co-founders of Echelon Front, where I work, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. They're the co-authors of Extreme Ownership. And really the book is based upon their experience overseas in combat in some of the harshest environments. And what they found, they found success over there, again, in one of the worst places and one of the worst times that they could be, but they found it by everyone taking ownership. And that meant at every level, not just the brigade commander, not just the SEAL operators, but everyone all the way down to that frontline operator was taking ownership. And again, when you do that, problems go away, problems get solved, and you're able to focus on the mission and execute that mission more effectively. So extreme ownership is empowering. It gives us a lot of control. It helps us solve problems. It helps us do so many amazing things in our life. It helps our lives get better. And ultimately, it really helps the lives of the people around us so that we can continue to work on the things that we want to work on, and we can get better at the things where we need to get better and move our missions forward.
Well, that's amazing. Meg, thank you so much for being here with us today. I've heard you speak before. I think you are amazing. And I know that you were an athlete before you joined here. And I know that you've had a full life. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. It was great to be here and really appreciate it, and just an honor. Thank you.
Take care. As Meg says, the most significant difference between ownership and apologizing is taking action to solve problems or correct mistakes. Ownership gives you the power to take responsibility for your errors and faults. You can take actions to implement solutions. When issues get solved and solutions are carried out, our lives and the lives of the people around us improve. Ownership allows you to continue moving the mission forward at work and at home. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.